With a life full of travel and relationships like Paul's, there are many chances for undesigned coincidences to pop up. So many that it's worth taking a moment to consider some evidence that Acts was not written by somebody who had Paul's letters in front of them. For example, check out the account Paul gives of his escape from Damascus in 2 Corinthians 11 and compare it with the version in Acts chapter 9. The main facts are the same, but the differences make it clear that the history wasn't written based on the letter. In 2 Corinthians, Paul mentions that Aretas had the city guarded, but there's no info on who did the guarding. In Acts, we're told that the Jews kept watch at the gates for Paul, likely needing the approval of the ethnarch, yet Aretas is not named. Sure, you can try and reconcile these statements. He who does a thing by another does it himself, as the saying goes, but it's not believable that the Acts writer crafted the history based on the letter. Or compare the story of Paul's conversion in Acts with Paul's own version in Galatians. In Acts we read, "Now he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.'" Comparing this with Galatians 1:15-17, "When it pleased God to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. I did not go to Jerusalem to those who are apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned to Damascus." Now, this might seem like a small thing, but think about it. If the book of Acts was made up or written much later, why would the writer specifically mention Paul's conversion happening on the road to Damascus and then him going to the city afterward? Why Damascus of all places? Damascus isn't even a big deal in the rest of the Acts story. Some might guess that the Acts author got his info from Galatians and used it to spice up their own version, even if they didn't really know Paul or were making up some of the history. But there's a snag in that idea. Galatians, especially this particular part, has been used to argue that the story of Paul's early days in the book of Galatians doesn't match up with what's in Acts 9. Acts 9 skips the trip to Arabia, and it seems like Paul stayed in Damascus until he had to escape over the wall. Also, while Galatians suggests that Paul left Damascus for Jerusalem after 3 years, Acts doesn't seem to show that much time passing. Now, it's not like these differences between Acts and Galatians can't be reconciled. The Acts writer says Paul left Damascus because of a plot against him after many days, which could include 3 years involving a trip to Arabia and a return to Damascus that Acts doesn't mention. But if the author of Acts was using Galatians to try and match things up, they probably wouldn't have put in the Damascus part based on Paul's passing comment, while ignoring the trip to Arabia or the 3-year gap. Why include a subtle connection with Galatians and skip over the more obvious points that need explaining? That would mean the author of Acts was both super sneaky and a world-class screw-up at the same time. The fact that Damascus lines up is a sign that the Acts writer knew about Paul independently from Galatians. Or how about another undesigned coincidence? Galatians 1:18 says, "After 3 years, Paul headed to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him for 15 days. Now, why the short visit? It might raise an eyebrow that after 3 years, Paul's stay in Jerusalem was a brief 15 days. Wouldn't you think you'd want to pick Peter's brain a bit longer than 2 weeks? We could speculate that Paul was in a hurry to start some missionary work, but he doesn't provide the details. But there is no need to guess. Turn to Acts, and we have our answer. In Acts 9:29, we read that Paul argued with the Hellenists, and they were out to kill him. When the brothers caught wind of this plot, they whisked him away to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. Well, that explains it. Paul had to make a quick exit because there were people trying to martyr him not long after his conversion. But without looking at Acts, we'd be left wondering why his visit was so brief. If these undesigned coincidences don't come slyly from copying Paul's letters, then how do we explain them? By now, you've seen in the series that sheer luck is not a good explanation because there are so many of them. In future videos, we'll look at a few more examples of undesigned coincidences from the book of Acts, and then we'll move on to the Gospels, so stay tuned for more.